An ordinary visit to a local cafe turns into something far more shocking for 72-year-old Maddie Parker. What started as a quiet moment to rest quickly spirals into an event that will leave you speechless. You won't believe what happens next, so stay with us until the end. Trust me, you don't want to miss a single second of this story. If this video moves you, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. The crisp spring air nipped at Maddie Parker's cheeks as she slowly made her way down the crowded Manhattan sidewalk. At 72 years old, every step she took was calculated and deliberate. The uneven pavement beneath her feet felt like a cruel joke on her aching joints, each crack and dip threatening to send her tumbling. She clutched the strap of her worn leather purse with one hand, while the other adjusted her faded pink sweater. Once vibrant, it was now stretched and dulled from years of wear. A light breeze cut through the fabric like it wasn't even there, and Maddie pulled her coat tighter around her frail frame. The cold didn't just touch her skin, it seeped into her bones. Her fingers brushed over the small pill bottle tucked into the inside pocket of her coat. Addison's disease didn't care about the weather. It didn't care about how tired she was or how slow her steps had become over the years. Her medication schedule had to be followed like clockwork. One missed dose could send her body into a spiral, a crisis she might not walk away from. She glanced at her watch. 12:45 p.m. She had 15 minutes before her next dose, enough time to find somewhere warm to sit and take it properly. Her eyes scanned the street ahead. That's when she saw it. The sleek, modern exterior of Whitaker's Cafe, a new spot that had only just opened last week. Its large, crystal-clear windows framed the view of the inside like a perfect little diorama. People sat at polished wooden tables, sipping from porcelain mugs, chatting with friends or typing away on laptops. Warmth radiated from the place, a sharp contrast to the unforgiving cold outside. Maddie's heart warmed at the sight of it. Grand, opening banners still hung from the windows, their bright ribbons swaying lightly with the wind. Her fingers twitched. She could already feel the pull of exhaustion creeping into her limbs. She had been walking too long. The warmth inside that cafe wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity. Her eyes flicked back to her watch, 12:50 p.m. There was still time. Her heart made the decision before her mind could catch up. With slow, careful steps, she made her way toward the entrance of the cafe. The heavy glass door resisted her push, but she leaned in, using her full weight to open it. The moment she stepped inside, a wave of warmth washed over her. Her shoulders dropped with a relief, the tension that had been building since she stepped outside finally releasing. Her eyes closed briefly as the jazz music playing softly in the background wrapped around her like a blanket. The rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baked pastries filled the air. Conversations hummed like a low buzz, the clinking of cups and plates adding to the gentle atmosphere. Maddie took it all in with a deep breath. This was peace. This was exactly what she needed. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for a quiet spot where she could sit and not be disturbed. Most of the seats were taken, but she spotted a booth near the back corner. It was perfect. Secluded. Quiet. She shuffled toward it, her feet moving slower now as the fatigue settled deeper into her legs. Her joints screamed at her with every step, but she kept going. When she finally reached the booth, she eased herself into the seat, letting out a long, relieved breath as she sat down. Her knees ached, her hips ached, but the soft leather seat felt like heaven. She shrugged off her coat, folding it neatly beside her. Her fingers rubbed the tender skin on her hands where the cold had left them raw. A young waitress approached with a bright, friendly smile. Her curly brown hair bounced with every step. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Welcome to Whitaker's Cafe. Can I get you started with something to drink?" Maddie returned the smile, grateful for the warmth in the girl's voice. "Yes, dear. I'd like a cup of hot water, please. And do you have any fruit tarts? Something light and sweet." "Absolutely. We've got lemon, raspberry, and mixed berry. Which one would you like?" "Mixed berry, please. And if it's not too much trouble, could I get a warm towel as well?" "Of course, ma'am. I'll be right back with your order," the waitress said, still smiling before she turned and walked away. Maddie reached into her purse, pulling out her pill bottle. She set it on the table next to a small compact mirror and a tube of lipstick. It was a ritual she had done for years. Check her face, smooth her hair, and touch up her lipstick before taking her medication. It gave her a sense of control in a life that often felt unpredictable. She glanced at her watch. 12:58 p.m., right on schedule. But her moment of peace didn't last long. The sound of someone clearing their throat made her glance up. Standing at the edge of her booth was a tall man with sharp features, a lean frame, and eyes that held years of entitlement. His name tag gleamed under the cafe's soft lights: James Whitaker, manager. He wasn't smiling. His eyes scanned her from head to toe like she was a stain on his spotless cafe. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone sharp and direct. Maddie tilted her head slightly, confused by his sudden appearance. "No, sir. I'm just waiting for my order. The young waitress is bringing me a cup of hot water and a tart." His eyes narrowed. "And you asked for a warm towel, too, didn't you?" Her brow furrowed. "Yes, I did. Is that a problem?" He chuckled, but it wasn't the friendly kind of laugh. "Yeah, it's a problem. This is a cafe, not a spa." Maddie blinked, genuinely surprised. "I'm sorry if that was an inconvenience. I can do without it if it's too much trouble." "Trouble?" He leaned forward, just slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. "Lady, you think you can just walk in here and start making demands like you're someone important?" Her heart pounded in her chest. The warmth of the cafe suddenly felt suffocating. "Sir, I'm a paying customer, just like everyone else here. I have every right to be treated with dignity and respect." "Dignity and respect?" He scoffed, his eyes scanning her sweater and her worn purse. "People like you don't belong here." Those words hit her like a slap. Her chest tightened, and for a brief second her hands shook, but she placed them firmly on the table, fingers folded neatly on top of each other. Her eyes locked onto his, steady and unwavering. "Sir, I'm not leaving." His eyes flickered with something. Surprise, maybe anger. "You'll leave when I tell you to leave," he hissed. At that moment, the waitress returned, carrying a tray with a cup of hot water, a mixed berry tart, and a neatly folded warm towel. Her face lit up when she saw Maddie. "Here you go, ma'am." Before she could finish, Whitaker's hand shot out, snatching the tray from the waitress. "Sir, what are you—" But he didn't answer. His eyes stayed on Maddie. Slowly, deliberately, he tilted the tray forward. The cup of hot water tipped first. The scalding liquid splashed across Maddie's hands and arms. She gasped sharply, pulling her hands back as the burning sensation hit her. Her heart raced as her nerves registered the pain. The tart slipped from the tray, crashing onto her lap, and the warm berry filling smeared across her pink sweater like blood. Her body jerked back, but she didn't scream. Her breathing grew shallow as she stared at her hands, red and burning. The pain was sharp, but sharper still was the humiliation. Her heart felt heavy, but she refused to cry. She would not cry. "Oh, no," Whitaker said, his voice oozing mock concern. "How clumsy of me." He laughed softly, darkly, like he had just told the funniest joke in the world. Her eyes darted around the cafe. No one moved. No one stood up for her. People looked away, glued to their phones and laptops, her lips pressed into a tight line, and slowly she reached for her purse. Her pill bottle was soaked, the label peeling away. She clutched it to her chest as she stood on unsteady legs. Whitaker's cold voice followed her. "Clean yourself up, or better yet, leave." Maddie lifted her head, eyes locking with his one last time. She didn't say a word. Her gaze spoke louder than anything she could have said. She turned and walked toward the bathroom, her steps slow, deliberate, but steady. She had faced worse in her life. She would face this too. Maddie Parker's hands still throbbed as she gripped the cold porcelain edge of the bathroom sink. Her breath came in shallow, shaky gasps, and her reflection in the mirror stared back at her with wide, weary eyes. Her pink sweater, once her favorite, was stained with sticky red berry filling, the dark streaks spreading across the fabric like battle scars. Her sleeves were damp, clinging to her arms where red blotches of scalded skin were beginning to swell. Her silver hair, once neatly pinned, now hung loose in stray strands, framing a face marked by exhaustion, pain, and quiet fury. Her hands trembled as she reached for a wad of paper towels. The rough texture scratched against her burnt skin as she dabbed at the stains on her sweater, knowing full well it wouldn't come clean. Her eyes dropped to her pill bottle, still clutched in her other hand. The label was soaked, the ink smudged to the point of being unreadable. Her heart sank as she twisted the cap off and poured the contents into her palm. Her worst fear was confirmed. Most of the pills had dissolved into a mushy, sticky paste. Only a few remained intact, and even those looked questionable. Her breath grew faster, her chest tightening. The warning signs of an Addisonian crisis were already creeping in. "Not now," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "Not now, Maddie." Her eyes darted to her watch. 1:08 p.m. She was already late for her dose. Her fingers moved quickly, carefully fishing out one of the few dry pills that remained. Her hands shook so badly she almost dropped it. "Steady, Maddie. Steady," she muttered, breathing slowly through her nose. She popped the pill into her mouth, reached for the faucet, and let the cold water trickle into her cupped hands. It wasn't the cleanest way to take her medicine, but she had no choice. She tilted her head back and swallowed. Her throat tightened as the pill slid down, but it was done. It wasn't enough. She knew one pill wouldn't fully prevent a crisis, but it was all she had. Her reflection caught her attention again. She didn't see the frail old woman she expected to see. Not this time. Her reflection didn't look weak. It didn't look defeated. Her lips pressed into a firm line, her eyes sharper than before. She had seen this look before, in herself, after every hardship she'd ever faced. After her husband passed away. After she fought with doctors to get the right diagnosis for her illness. After every time someone looked down on her, thinking she was just some old woman who could be ignored. Her hands still shook, her heart still raced, but her resolve was set. "You're stronger than this, Maddie Parker," she whispered to her reflection. "You faced worse. You'll face this too." She adjusted her sweater as best as she could, ignoring the damp, sticky patches that clung to her skin. Her gaze lingered on her reflection a moment longer, then she turned and walked back into the cafe. The atmosphere had changed. It wasn't the warmth she'd felt when she first walked in. It was colder now, heavier, Conversations were quieter, but she could feel eyes on her. Some customers glanced her way, others pretended not to notice her at all. Her eyes flicked to her old booth, but it had been taken by a well-dressed couple, both of them sipping lattes as if nothing had happened. Her gaze shifted to the counter, where James Whitaker leaned against it, sipping from a white coffee mug. His eyes caught hers, and his lips curled into a slow, venomous smirk. "Still here, huh?" he called out, loud enough for the entire cafe to hear. The smugness in his voice was unmistakable. "Guess you didn't learn the first time." Maddie didn't stop walking. Her knees ached. Her joints felt like they were filled with broken glass, but she didn't falter. Her eyes stayed on him, unwavering. "Looks like you missed a spot," Whitaker sneered, gesturing toward the berry stains on her sweater. His two employees behind the counter stifled quiet laughs, their eyes darting between Whitaker and Maddie like children watching a playground bully. Her fingers twitched, but she kept them folded neatly in front of her as she approached an empty booth at the far end of the cafe. It was colder there, away from the large windows where the sun once shined. Slowly, carefully, she slid into the seat, wincing as her knees bent and her joints strained. Her breath came slow and steady. Her eyes closed for just a moment as she centered herself. Her fingers traced the edge of the table. It was cool to the touch, solid and steady, unlike the people in this place. Her eyes flickered open just in time to see one of the workers, a stocky man with a shaved head and crossed arms, walking toward her. His steps were slow, purposeful. He stopped at the edge of her booth, his face blank, but his eyes held that same look she'd seen too many times before, the look of someone who had already decided she didn't belong. "Manager wants to know if you're planning to stay here all day," he said flatly, his voice as cold as the wind outside. Maddie raised her head slowly, her eyes meeting his with steady calm. Her voice was sharp and clear. "I have every right to be here just like everyone else." The man raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. Sure. But he says if you're not ordering anything, it's time to leave." Her fingers clenched on the edge of the table, but her face remained calm. "I ordered hot water and a tart," she said firmly. "Your manager decided to ruin them." Her eyes narrowed as she leaned forward slightly. "If you have a problem with that, you can take it up with him." The man hesitated. His eyes flickered to the other side of the cafe, where Whitaker was still leaning against the counter, casually sipping his coffee like he had nothing to worry about. His jaw tightened, but he didn't say a word. He glanced back at Maddie, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Lady, I'm not getting paid enough to argue with you," he muttered, shaking his head. "You can stay if you want, just don't cause any trouble." "Trouble?" Maddie scoffed, her voice stronger now. "I'm a 72-year-old woman. If you think I'm causing trouble, maybe you should take a look at yourself." The man blinked, clearly not expecting that. He let out a grunt, shook his head, and walked away. Maddie watched him go, eyes still narrowed, her pulse finally slowing. Her breath came slow and steady now. Her gaze shifted to Whitaker, and for a brief moment, their eyes met. His smirk was still there, but it wasn't as sharp as it had been before. Something in his face had changed. Maybe it was the way she stared back at him, calm, defiant, and unyielding. She sat straighter in her seat, her hands folded neatly on the table like she was sitting in church. Her eyes didn't waver. She didn't blink. "They will not break me," she whispered under her breath. "Not today. Not ever." Her gaze didn't shift, not even when Whitaker slammed his coffee cup on the counter, his eyes narrowing into sharp, dangerous slits. He muttered something to the worker next to him, his jaw tight with restrained anger. Maddie could see it now. The mask of control he'd been wearing was cracking. Her eyes followed him as he stepped away from the counter, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Each step echoed louder than it should have, like warning drums in the distance. Every customer in the cafe felt it. Conversations died down. Heads turned. Forks hovered in midair as all eyes shifted toward Whitaker, watching, waiting, knowing something was about to happen. He walked toward her booth slowly, his hands at his sides, fingers flexing as if preparing for something. His eyes locked on hers, sharp and cold. The quiet hum of the cafe was gone, replaced with tense, stifling silence. Still, Maddie didn't move. Her breathing stayed steady. Her fingers didn't tremble. Her heart didn't race. If he thought he was about to scare her, he had no idea who he was dealing with. The tense silence in Whitaker's cafe was thicker than the strongest cup of coffee. All eyes were on James Whitaker as he strode toward Maddie Parker's booth, his eyes locked on hers with a predator's focus. Each step echoed through the room like the ticking of a countdown clock. Customers shifted in their seats, glancing at each other nervously. Some reached for their phones, pretending to be distracted, but their cameras were recording. No one spoke. No one intervened. They all knew something was about to happen, but no one wanted to be the one to stop it. Maddie sat still, hands folded neatly on the table, her spine straight, her eyes unblinking. Her heart beat steadily in her chest, not from fear, but from resolve. Her burned hands ached, her arms still stung, but she didn't flinch. She kept her gaze locked on Whitaker as he approached, his lips curling into that same condescending smirk he'd worn earlier. "You're still here, huh?" His voice was sharp, loud, and meant for everyone in the cafe to hear. "Guess you didn't get the message the first time, Grandma." Maddie didn't respond. Her gaze never wavered. Her fingers remained perfectly still. Whitaker stopped a few feet from her booth, his hands on his hips, his head tilted at an angle like he was inspecting something beneath him. "You think you're making some kind of statement sitting there, acting like you're somebody special?" His eyes scanned her sweater again, pausing on the berry stains. "All I see is a mess, and that mess is sitting in my booth." Still, Maddie didn't move. She didn't blink. She didn't rise to his bait. Her silence seemed to enrage him. His jaw tightened, his nostrils flared, and he stepped forward, leaning down so his face was just inches from hers. "You hear me, old lady? I said you're done. Get up, get out, or I'll make you." A murmur rippled through the crowd. No one said anything, but the tension was palpable. Eyes darted from Whitaker to Maddie and back to Whitaker. Everyone was waiting to see what she would do. But Maddie didn't do anything. She sat there, calm as ever, her eyes locked on his like he wasn't even a threat. "You done?" Maddie asked softly, tilting her head just a fraction. The question threw Whitaker off for a moment. His eyebrows twitched, his smirk faltered. "What did you just say?" "I said," Maddie's voice was low but firm, "are you done?" She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing into sharp points. "Because I'm not going anywhere, Mr. Whitaker. You can shout. You can puff up your chest. You can even break another plate if it makes you feel big. But I'm not moving. I've sat through worse than you in my life, and I'm still sitting right here." The crowd's murmuring grew louder. Customers exchanged glances, some nodding in silent agreement. A few even picked up their phones, angling their cameras toward the scene. Whitaker noticed. His eyes darted toward the crowd, his smirk vanishing completely. He was losing control of the room, and he knew it. "All right, you want to play it like that?" he muttered, his voice lower now but far more dangerous. "Fine." He took a step back, his eyes still locked on hers. "But you're not gonna like how this ends." Suddenly, the bell above the cafe's entrance jingled. The cold air swept in as the door swung open. All heads turned to see who it was. A figure stepped inside, tall and slow, moving with the kind of ease that only someone with complete confidence could manage. A long, black coat hung from his shoulders, swaying with each step. A thick gold chain caught the light as he moved, and his unmistakable face came into view. It was him. It was Snoop Dogg. The cafe froze. Gasps echoed through the room. Phones shot up like it was a concert. People whispered to each other in disbelief. "Is that Snoop Dogg? No way, that's him. That's him for real." Snoop glanced around, his eyes hidden behind dark-tinted shades. He didn't rush. He didn't have to. His slow, deliberate steps said everything. He took off his glasses with one smooth motion, folding them in his hand. His eyes scanned the room, taking in every face, every corner. His gaze finally settled on Maddie. His head tilted slightly as he noticed the stains on her sweater and the way her hands trembled slightly. He looked at her, then at Whitaker. His lips pressed together, and something cold and dangerous flashed in his eyes. Snoop walked forward, his steps slow and heavy, like a drumbeat before a battle. Whitaker's smirk was gone. He straightened up, his eyes darting between Snoop and the crowd. His confidence faltered. "You," Snoop said, pointing at Whitaker with one long, ring-covered finger. "This you?" Whitaker blinked. "What?" Snoop didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He tilted his head forward slightly, his eyes locked onto Whitaker with deadly precision. "This you?" he repeated, his voice sharp and cold. Whitaker's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "I don't know what you're talking about, man. This ain't got nothing to do with you." Snoop smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Wrong answer." He took one step closer, his voice still calm, still deadly. "See? I know what you did. Everybody in here knows what you did. You put your hands on her, poured hot water on her, ruined her meds. You feel big now, huh? Feel like a big man? Man, I don't know who you think you are, but you're not going to walk in here and tell me how to run my cafe," Whitaker said, his voice cracking slightly. Snoop tilted his head back and let out a short, quiet laugh. "Run your cafe?" he repeated slowly, like he was tasting the words. "See, I ain't got to tell you how to run your cafe, but I will tell you this. You about to learn how to run out of business." More murmurs from the crowd. Cameras were recording every second of it. "You're done, Whitaker," Snoop said, pointing at him again. "But you got one chance to walk out of this with a little bit of dignity. Get on your knees. Apologize to her. Apologize loud, so everyone in here can hear it." Whitaker's eyes widened. "You're out of your damn mind," he barked. "I'm not getting on my knees for nobody, especially not for her." He sneered, his eyes flicking to Maddie. "People like her don't deserve it." The cafe went dead silent. It was like the entire world stopped breathing. Snoop's smile faded instantly. His jaw tightened, his eyes locked on Whitaker like a wolf sizing up prey. "Last chance, boy," Snoop said softly, stepping even closer. "You kneel or you fall. Choose." Whitaker hesitated, looking around for support. None of his employees met his eyes. The customers stayed quiet, watching with their phones held high. Snoop leaned in, his eyes narrowed to slits. "Go ahead, James. Try me." Sweat dripped down Whitaker's face. His chest heaved. Slowly, painfully, he lowered himself to one knee. His face was twisted with rage, his eyes burning with hate, but he knew he had lost. He looked up at Maddie, his lips pressed into a tight line. "I'm sorry," he hissed, his voice barely a whisper. "Louder," Snoop said, his eyes as cold as steel. Whitaker's face twisted with fury, but he gritted his teeth and shouted, "I'm sorry." "Now stay there," Snoop said, pulling out his phone and holding it up. "Let the world see what happens to bullies." He hit record and pointed it right at Whitaker's face. "Say, hi, James." Whitaker lowered his head, but it was too late. Cameras were already rolling. The world was about to see him kneel. Snoop glanced over at Maddie. "You good, Miss Parker?" Her eyes met his, and for the first time that day, she smiled. "Yeah," she said quietly, her voice steady as a rock. "Yeah, I'm good." "Let's get you out of here," Snoop said. He took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. "Ain't no reason for you to be around these fools." They walked toward the door together, and every eye in the cafe followed them. Phones were still recording, capturing every second. By the time they reached the sidewalk, #Justice for Maddie was already trending. The cold air outside hit Maddie Parker's face, but it no longer felt as harsh as before. Her steps were slow but steady as she moved alongside Snoop Dogg, his long black coat draped over her shoulders like a shield. Each step she took felt heavier than the last, but not from pain, from the weight of everything she had endured inside Whitaker's cafe. Her hands still throbbed from the burns, her sweater still bore the dark red stains from the berry tart, but none of that mattered now. Her head was held high. People on the street stopped in their tracks when they saw them. Eyes widened. Phones were raised. "That's Snoop Dogg," someone whispered. Others pointed at Maddie, their faces a mixture of shock and admiration. Some people knew. They had seen the live stream. Others didn't know what had happened yet, but they could tell something important had just taken place. Strangers murmured to one another as the pair made their way down the sidewalk. "You all right, Miss Parker?" Snoop asked, glancing at her out of the corner of his eye. His voice was calm but watchful, like he was ready for anything. Maddie nodded, adjusting the coat around her shoulders. "I'm all right, baby. I'm all right." Her breath came in small clouds as she exhaled, the cold air mixing with the warmth of her resolve. "Good," Snoop said, pulling out his phone. His fingers moved with precision as he tapped on the screen. "Gotta make sure the world knows what went down." He opened the live stream app, and with one tap, they were live again. The camera flipped to show his face first. His cool, steady gaze filled the screen, and thousands of viewers flooded in within seconds. Comments began popping up at a rapid pace. "Yo, what happened, Snoop? Tell us the story, King. Who hurt the lady? Expose them." "Y'all see this?" Snoop said, his eyes narrowing into the camera. He flipped it around, pointing it at Maddie. "This is Miss Maddie Parker. Today, she walked into Whitaker's cafe just to get a hot drink and a little peace. But instead, that man in there, James Whitaker, the so-called manager, decided to humiliate her. He poured hot water on her. He destroyed her medication. He put his hands on her." The comments exploded. "Nah, not okay. Shut that place down. Call the law on that fool." Snoop flipped the camera back to himself, his face cold and sharp as steel. "So, here's what we're gonna do, family. We're gonna let Whitaker know that there's nowhere to hide. You can disrespect people all you want in your little cafe, but when you do it to Miss Parker, you just disrespected all of us." He leaned in closer to the camera, his eyes cutting straight through the screen. "Run those hashtags. #Justice for Maddie. #Shutdown Whitakers. I want to see it everywhere. I want his name in every headline, every timeline, every phone screen in the country." He ended the stream with one final message. "Don't just watch, do something." By the time he slipped the phone back into his pocket, Maddie glanced up at him, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "You sure know how to get people's attention," she said softly. He tilted his head, giving her a sly grin. "Baby, attention's the easy part. Keeping it? That's where it gets real." They kept walking. It wasn't long before they reached Maddie's apartment building, a small, weathered brick structure that had stood for decades, strong despite the years. Maddie had lived there for almost 40 years. She knew every crack in the sidewalk, every loose step on the stairwell. As they approached the entrance, she spotted someone pacing near the door. Her heart lifted as she recognized him. It was Michael, her grandson. He was already walking toward them, his eyes darting between Snoop Dogg and Maddie. Gran, what happened to you?" His voice was full of concern, his eyes fixed on the stains on her sweater and the red blotches on her hands. "Did someone hurt you?" "I'm all right, baby," Maddie said, waving him off. "Just had a little run-in with a fool who didn't know better." She glanced at Snoop, and her smile widened. But I wasn't alone. Michael's jaw dropped as he finally realized who was standing beside her. Wait, is that Snoop Dogg?" His voice jumped an octave and his eyes grew as wide as saucers. Snoop raised a hand, giving a simple nod. "What's good, little man?" Michael stared for a second, his mouth hanging open. "Gran, how do you always end up living the wildest life?" Maddie laughed softly, the sound warm and real. "Life don't give you choices, baby. It just throws you in, and you gotta swim." They made their way up the steps, Snoop still at Maddie's side. As they reached her apartment door, Michael unlocked it and stepped inside first, glancing around like he was expecting trouble. "Place is clear," he said, motioning them inside. Snoop stepped in, his presence filling the small apartment instantly. He moved with the kind of calm authority that made you feel safe without even knowing why. He took a seat in one of the armchairs by the window, his hands resting on his knees. Maddie sat down slowly on the couch, leaning back with a deep sigh. Her eyes closed for a moment, letting the warmth of her home sink into her tired bones. Michael sat next to her, scrolling through his phone. His eyes widened as his thumbs moved rapidly across the screen. "Gran, you're all over the internet. Look." He held his phone out for her to see. #Justice for Maddie is already trending. People are going crazy about that video Snoop posted." Maddie glanced at the screen. Her face appeared on it, her sweater stained, her eyes strong, her hands red with burns. It felt strange seeing herself like that. The words beneath the photo were bold. "Elderly woman attacked by cafe owner." Her eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a firm line. "They love you when you're the victim," she muttered quietly. "But let's see if they love you when you stand up." Michael frowned. "What do you mean, Gran?" Before she could answer, there was a loud knock at the door. 3 sharp bangs. Bang, bang, bang. All 3 of them froze. Michael glanced at Maddie, his face full of confusion. "You expecting someone?" "No," she said, her voice low and firm. Another set of knocks, louder this time. Bang, bang, bang. "Open up, NYPD." A deep voice barked from the other side of the door. Michael's face twisted in confusion. "Police?" He glanced at Snoop. "What they want?" Snoop's eyes locked on the door, his face now calm and still like a predator waiting for a mistake. "They ain't cops," he said, his voice low and sharp. Maddie's heart jumped in her chest. "You sure?" she whispered. "Trust me," Snoop said, rising slowly from the chair. His movements were slow, controlled, deliberate. Cops don't bang like that, and real cops don't show up unannounced this late. They heard whispering on the other side of the door, followed by more banging. "Open up, Parker. We just want to talk," the voice barked again. "Yeah, and I just want to win the lottery," Snoop muttered under his breath. His fingers tapped on his phone, sending a message with lightning speed. "Give it 2 minutes. Real cops'll be here." Just as he said it, the faint sound of police sirens echoed in the distance. The men on the other side of the door froze. "Nah, man, I'm not getting caught up in this," one of them muttered. Footsteps, the sound of running. The door to the building opened and slammed shut. Michael exhaled hard, his heart still pounding. What was that, Gran?" "Pressure," Maddie replied, her eyes locked on the door. "They want me to feel small. They want me to be quiet." "Did it work?" Snoop asked, tilting his head toward her. Her eyes stayed on the door, sharp and unyielding. "Not today," she said firmly. Snoop nodded, a grin forming on his face. "That's what I thought." As the police lights flashed outside, Snoop sat back down, his eyes never leaving the door. The world knew her name now, and if Whitaker or anyone else thought she'd stay quiet, they were about to learn a hard lesson. And that's how everything changed for Maddie Parker. Sometimes the smallest moments create the biggest waves. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Like, comment, and share it with someone who needs to see it. Your support helps bring more powerful stories like this to life. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another unforgettable story. Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts. We love hearing from you. Until next time, stay safe and stay strong.